you, Dr. Ge. It's my great honor to introduce my recent year's study on the accountability issues. Let's start with very basic observation about the count-mass distinction in English. It involves the interplay between ontology, cognition, and language. Let's start from the ontological level. We know that there are two distinct types of entities. One is countable entities like individual apples, and the other is substance or liquid, which are not countable. So as the cognitive level, these two types of entities are conceptualized differently. For instance, the apple object or versus water substance. Then if we go up at the linguistic level, they are encoded as two types of nouns. One is count nouns, the other is mass nouns. So apples is the count use. We can say an apple or 3 apples. But by contrast, we cannot say 3 waters. Instead, if you want to quantify water, we need to use a measure word like a puddle of water. So these are the very basic facts. It seems that we have very nice object and substance distinction as reflected in language as count nouns versus mass nouns. However, things are not so straightforward. As we can see, sometimes the same entity can be classified differently, either as count or mass in a language, in the same language, or cross-linguistically. Let me give you an example. For instance, the same entity like shoe can be referred to as count noun, shoes, or mass noun, footwear. So this is in English. If you look at this issue as from a cross-linguistic perspective, the same entity like a set of sofa can be referred to in internally as count noun, but as mass noun in English as furniture. So we just saw the furniture type nouns. So this type of nouns is very cast us a very amazing things, some problem. Syntactically is a mass, so we cannot say 5 furnitures or many furnitures. But semantically, how to interpret this type of nouns is a lot of debate regarding the semantic interpretation. So the question is, does the word like footwear, luggage, and clothing, do they refer to the same things as shoes, suitcases, or garments, respectively? So this is a puzzling questions for us. If we look at the count-mass issues from the cross-linguistic perspective, we can discuss the count-mass issues in Mandarin. So unlike in English, nouns in Mandarin are not obligatory marked in countabilities. So we have bare nouns. So nouns in Mandarin can appear in a bare form without obligatory markers of count or mass. For instance, we can say 桌上有苹果 or 桌上有水. Here, 苹果 and 水 is a bare form with no grammatical markers to mark its countability. And furthermore, we use classifiers in Mandarin to quantify and individuate entities. So we say 桌上有个苹果 and 桌上有杯水. With the classified 个 and the 杯, the information quantity and individuation becomes very clear now. So with these typological features, there's great theoretical controversy with regards to count-mass issues in Mandarin. The first question is the count-mass distinction in the lexicon? In other words, does the 苹果 and the 水 mean the same thing as apple and water in English? And the second question is, what is the grammatical function of classifier in Mandarin? Okay, so for both English and Mandarin, we have a central question. So the first question is, does the grammar mirror the world? with count nouns referring to object and the mass nouns referring to stuff. So this represents a semantic view on the count mass issue. Alternatively, we ask, does grammar instruct us on how to quantify the entities in the world? So telling us how to count and what to count and what to measure with grammatical markers. This represents a syntactic view on the count mass. Okay, so this is to answer this question, this talk is going to organized in 3 parts. In the first part, we're going to review the development of countability issues research. So we'll introduce the framework evolution from the traditional semantic count to syntactic count. And we also examine the experimental method that is widely used in current research on count mass issue, that is quantity judgment task. But these tasks represent a challenge for the syntactic count. I would say it is a apparent challenge for the syntactic count. And then we move on to the second part. We're going to present new evidence from Mandarin Chinese by reporting 3 studies on the interpretation of object noun and the collective nouns and the Mandarin nouns, animate nouns. We're going to use a new research method, which is called a truth-based judgment task. Then the result shows that the syntactic count still hold. So we support with very robust data to support the syntactic count. And in the last part, we're going to see something about future directions by talking about some implications for the cross-linguistic research and the possible clinical application. Okay, let's move on to the first part about the evolution of countability research. So as just mentioned, there is a theoretical shift, theoretical paradigm in the study of English count distinction. The English countabilities, that is from the semantic count to syntactic count. Let's focus on the semantic count first. So back in 1960s, in Quine's classic book, Names and Object, so he characterized the semantic nature of the count mass distinction. So according to Quine, the count nouns have the features of divided reference. So let me explain what is divided reference. That means count nouns can denote objects that inherently individuated. For instance, the word cat refers to a distinct individual cat. So the logic like this, if X is a cat and Y is a cat, then the combination of X, Y is not a cat because the reference of cat is divided. So that is what he means, the divided reference. So by contrast, the reference of mass nouns is not divided, instead is cumulative. So they denote substances that are inherently homogeneous. For example, water. The water refers to substance as undifferentiated whole. So if X is water and Y is water, then the combination of X, Y is also water. So this is quite different from the reference of count nouns like cat. So the implication of Quine's semantic count is that countability is lexically determined, so it's stored in the noun's meaning. Okay, there's a very fundamental problem for the semantic count, that is flexibility of the countability, as pointed out by many scholars. In particular, a typical count noun can be made a mass. For instance, we can say there's rabbit in this stew. So rabbit we know is a typical count noun, but this sentence can mean there's rabbit meat in this stew. A philosopher Pelletier can name this phenomenon as universal grinder, meaning that the typical noun referring to object can be refers to substance in some specific context. So if we put something object into the machine called universal grinder, it then comes out the substance in the other end. So according to Pelletier, if we provide a very finite context, then a typical noun can get mass interpretation. On the other hand, a typical mass noun can be made count. So for instance, we can say in this lab, we store 3 bloods. So we know blood is a typical mass noun. But in this case, this sentence means in this lab, we store 3 blood types or 3 blood samples. Again, Pelletier used another term of thought experiment named universal packager to refer to this phenomena that is turning a substance into a portion or unit. So this is the machine. We can put a substance and come out a portion or unit of this substance. That is a counter use of mass nouns. Okay, so we now move on to the syntactic count. So syntactic count means that countability is not a property of words. So this is quite different from the semantic count. So basic word root is underspecified in countability. So according to the syntactic count, countability is determined in the syntax structures that words are placed into. So in the count syntax, so word root can get a count interpretation, but in the absence of morphological marker marking the countabilities, the bare nouns and the mass nouns should be available for them. So Borel 2005 proposed this revolutionized idea, I think, the syntactic count. So syntactic count provide a very good and I think satisfactory explanation on the flexibility of countabilities we just mentioned. So according to this account, the same lexicon root can get different interpretation in distinct syntactic structures. For instance, the same word root rabbit, if we put rabbit in the count context and count structure, like this, the first sentence, there are some rabbits in the garden. So then this word root gets the count interpretation referring to object. But on the other hand, the rabbit, if we put this word into mass structure, like this sentence, there's a rabbit in this stew, then this word can get mass interpretation. So interpret referring to as a substance. Okay, in a similar way, the typical mass noun like blood can also get mass interpretation and count interpretation. So if we put this word into mass structure, there is some blood on the table, then this word interpret as substance. But the same word can get count interpretation in sentence like 3 bloods are stored here. You can see that it works very nicely, interpretation, this flexibility of countabilities in the syntactic count. And also this count can explain well. Once a noun entered a syntactic domain, its count mass status cannot be changed anymore. For instance, this example is taken from Borel's book. We cannot say there's rabbits in my stew. This is because the rabbit first is put in a count context, is pluralized as rabbits. So you cannot converse anymore in a mass context. So this sentence is ungrammatical. Okay, so why we have such flexibility of countability? That is because we can have multiple dimensions of word root, according to more recent study, Rosten. So according to her, the word root encode various dimensions, not a simple meaning. Instead, we have multiple dimensions, and the count and the mass uses corresponds to cardinal versus non-cardinal dimensions, respectively. So let me explain this. So the cardinal, for the count use, if we put apple, this word root into count syntax, as in 2 apples, then this phrase pick the cardinal dimension by referring to the cardinality of entities, the numbers of entities, with other dimensions determined. So two apples, when we talk about two apples, we just know the cardinal number of apples without knowing how big these apples. It could be two big apples or two small apples. So the dimension of size or weight are underdetermined. And for the mass use, the structure only pick non-cardinal dimensions. Another example, if we say 2 pounds of apples, this indicates the dimension of weight. So other dimensions like cardinal numbers is underdetermined. So if we talk about 2 pounds of apples, it could be 2 big apples or 4 small apples, or it could even sliced apples, whole apples or apple chunks. So for this sentence, we can say the recipe calls for 2 pounds of apples. You can see the count uses and the mass uses corresponds to different dimensions, the cardinal dimension versus non-cardinal dimensions. So this explains why we have such flexibility of countability. Okay, so we just talked about the semantic versus syntactic count in English. Now we move on to the study of countability in Mandarin. We saw similar theoretical shift. So let's look at the semantic count of Mandarin first. A lot of scholars back to Zhao Yuanren in 1968 to more recent studies. So according to this semantic account, interpretation of Mandarin nouns, they are fundamentally categorized based on the ontological properties of the referent. So, for instance, 苹果, they are taken as count nouns, and 水 taken as mass nouns. According to this account, the classifiers in Mandarin, they are just a refraction of semantic mirrors. So this is a direct quotation from Chen and Sibisman. So according to them, the individual classifiers simply name the unit in which the entity denoted by the noun naturally occurs. So the implication of this account is that grammar is just a reflection of pre-linguistics conceptual categories. The noun's meaning is primary. The classifier is just a lexical counterpart. So according to the syntactic account of Mandarin, we have these predictions. So according to this account, object nouns like 苹果 are count nouns. So the presence of individual classifiers do not change the countability of these object nouns. So there's no differences according to this account for the sentences like 女孩有更多苹果 versus 女孩有更多个苹果. So this semantic count would predict there's no interpret differences between these two sentences, which is not true according to our experiment. We'll report later. Okay, so even in the semantic count, they need to explain why sometimes the apples, this kind of count nouns, can have substance reading. Scholars like Chen, Duchess, and Sibisman 2008, they used the idea of a universal grinder to explain this limited flexibility. So they say in very special cases, like apple in salad, so some count nouns can get a substance reading through a pragmatic context-driven operation of universal grinder. But they also said this pragmatic universal grinder does not work always. There are some grammatical constraints. For instance, they say the mentioned example of animate nouns like go. So according to them, animate nouns like go can never get a substance denoted reading because of lexical blocking effect. They mentioned that if we want to denote the dog meat, we can have another compound word go for that meaning. So for them, go can never get substance reading, only count reading is possible. So this is the lexical blocking effect. Okay, so let's move on to the syntactic account of Mandarin. which is quite different. According to this syntactic account, countability is not inherent in nouns, but is constructed by syntax. So it's the similar idea as we just see in the count-mass distinction in Mandarin. About the role of classifier, so classifier is a functional head that create the name for counting. Remember, in the semantic count, they think the function of classifier is to name the unit that is already have in the lexicon. But for the syntactic count, the function of classifier is quite different. They create the unit for counting. So this count would predict that bare nouns are semantically flexible because it's not lexically defined, it's under-specified. But once you have a classifier, then we have fixed reading. Okay, and also the similar multiple dimensions of word root applies in the syntactic count of Mandarin countabilities. So 苹果, like apple in English, encodes different dimensions, and the count use corresponds to cardinal dimension, and non-cardinal dimensions correspond to mass use. So if the similar example, when we say 两个苹果, we talk about two apples without specifying these two apples are big or small. So the dimension of size or weight is underspecified. And similarly, when you talk about 2斤苹果, it's like 2 pounds of apples in English. We indicate weight of entities, but the numbers information is underspecified. Okay, so the syntactic count would predict that these two sentences, 女孩有更多苹果, has different interpretation as the 女孩有更多个苹果. So according to this account, the first sentence, 女孩有更多苹果, should have both count and mass readings. But with the classifier, 女孩有更多个苹果, only count reading is possible. We can see that the semantic count and the syntactic count have two different predictions about these two, the same set of sentences. Okay, so yeah, let's summarize. We have talked about semantic count and versus syntactic count. They have different ontological basis and the role of grammatical markers and the status of bare nouns. Okay, so let's move on to the empirical research on the count mass issue. Let me first introduce the quantity judgment task, which is widely used in the field of study about count mass distinction. So this task is proposed by Barner-Stadtker in 2005. So in this task, we have two characters. So one character has fewer items, and the other one has smaller but more smaller entities. So yeah, character is a choose between these two characters. And the question is, who has more nouns? So nouns could have appear as mass context or count context. So let's give me examples. For instance, against this scenario, so the girl on the left side has 6 smaller rocks. The boy has 2 big rocks. And the participant could represent with the sentence like, who has more stone? So this is a mass context. Or count syntax, who has more stones? Then the task of participant is choose one of the characters. So as we said that the count interpretation corresponds to cardinal dimension and mass interpretation corresponds to non-cardinal dimension. So the result found that the participant, when they presented who has more stone, they would choose the boy on the right side. But when they presented with the count syntax sentence who has more stones, they would pick the characters, the girl on the left side. So this result shows that the count mass distinction It's not fundamentally about what a word refers to. It is about how we quantify with our language. So quantify the reference. So because we have the same entities, but encoded as a can't use in one case and must use in another case. Okay, so this methodology provides very good support for the syntactic account in English. For both, just mentioned that for both children and adult, the interpretation of the flexible nouns like stones, strings, papers is shaped by the syntactic context in which they appear. So yeah, this is, we just said, they give two distinct choice towards the sentence who has more stone versus who has more stones. Okay, so this result challenged the semantic count, according to which the same entities could not quantify differently. But this is exactly what predicted by the syntactic count. So this result nicely gives support to the syntactic count. And quantity judgment task is also used to test semantic English mass collective nouns like furniture or silver. Again, we have two characters. One character has a big fork and a knife, and the other characters has many more forks and knives, but smaller one. And then the participant were presented with the sentence like, who has more silver? So, they use the same design to test the participant's interpretation of count nouns like more shoes, who has more shoes, or mass nouns, who has more toothpaste. The result shows that the English-speaking elders and 5-year-old English children, they assign the count interpretation to the mass collectives. So they would, for both elders and the children, they pick the characters on the right side who has many more small items. The similar result for the count nouns. So based on this result, the percentage is 97% of the time. So very similar to the interpretation of count nouns. So based on this result, the same experimental design is widely adopted to test semantic interpretation of collectives in many other languages, like Japanese, Korean, Mandarin, Dutch, Hebrew, and Yuda and French. There's a special issue in Glossa, and they published a set of papers which all use the quant judgment task to test the collectives. So all these studies have found that participants assigned the count interpretation to collectives over 19% of the time. Based on these results, they say collectives at the lexical level, they carry the feature of individuation, and hence this explains why they always express their count interpretation. You can see they attribute the count interpretation to the lexical meanings. So this is a typical semantic interpretation, right? So it is semantic count. But this contradicts the hypothesis of the syntactic count. So according to syntactic count, the mass syntax should be flexible and underspecified. Then this semantic count would predict that both readings should be available to mass collective nouns in English or collective nouns or back collective nouns in other languages as well. So then what's the problem if? So this invites us to think about the methodology itself, the quantity judgment task. We think we have two problems with this quite widely used method. One is that this task actually is a forced choice task. Remember that the standard quantity judgment task is they ask question, who has more X? It is a binary forced choice. Participant choose one of the characters, which only reveal the preferred readings. So this kind of forced choice task cannot detect an ambiguous sentence. Right. The second problem is that all the experimental design in previous research, they do not provide phonetic context for the mass interpretation. We know the mass interpretation is not a favorite reading. Somehow it's disfavored reading, right? So previous studies, they always use neutral context or object favoring context. This kind of design does not provide salient context for the mass interpretation. So that's why they failed to test the mass interpretation, which in principle, according to the syntactic account, should be available. So the conclusion is that the dominant quantity judgment task may have prematurely conclude that collective nouns are lexically fixed as account, maybe because of the limitation of the task. Okay, so let's turn to the literature on the empirical study of countabilities in Mandarin. So far, the quantity judgment task is also used to test countabilities in Mandarin. So let's have a critical review here. For instance, they used the quantity judgment task to test the object nouns in this study, Chuni and Banner, 2010. So they test two types of sentences, 谁有更多球 versus 谁有更多个球, the bad noun versus classified noun. And they present the scenario like this. The girl have 2 big balls and the boy have 4 smaller balls. They asked 谁有更多球, right? 谁有更多个球. And the nouns they tested like a bowl, 碗, 杯子, 球, 盘子, 瓶子, 闹钟, 气球, 桌子, yeah, extra. So it is reported that this object nouns can only get count interpretation is 99% of the time for both sentence types. So remember, this is the result exactly what the semantic account predict. The semantic account predict no distinction between these two types of sentences. And the similar results are reported in other studies, in Liu 2014 and Ning and Schaeffer 2018. Yeah, they all tested object nouns and get the similar result. In our study, we test the same nouns, like one, base, and the ball, but we use another experiment method, and we got quite different result, as we're going to say later. And the quantity judgment task is also used to test the collective nouns. In 2 studies, one is Liu and the other is Ning and Schaeffer. And Liu only test adults, Mandarin adults. Ning and Schaeffer test Mandarin adults and the children. They use the similar design by asking who has more, 谁的家具更多. So the nouns they test include 家具, 工具, 餐具, 首饰, 衣服. And again, we use in our test, we use the same nouns, 家具, 工具, and 餐具 in our experiment, but we got different result. You can see the percentage, the count noun interpretation in these studies is quite high, is over 80%. Okay. So let me summarize the prior findings of Mandarin nouns. So they all use the standard quantity judgment task, which is forced choice in neutral context. And the result is very consistent. They all obtained the dominant count interpretation across object nouns and collective nouns. So our comments is that this result very likely they only reflect preferred reading under neutral conditions, not the full range of grammatical possible interpretations because of the limitation of the task. Okay, so they have some research gaps. So in methodology, the problem is just said quantity judgment task is only refers to preferred reading and cannot distinguish what is grammatical available interpretations versus pragmatically preferred interpretation. So we need a new paradigm which can test for the availability of less salient mass readings for nouns in mass context or bare forms. In theoretical side, we also have a gap. So the syntactic count predicts that the bare nouns should be underspecified in countability, should allow both count and mass interpretations depending on context. However, we have two challenges. One is the interpretation of collective nouns, which have very strong bias for count readings. The other one is animate nouns. We mentioned in the very beginning that there's a lexical blocking effect for the mass readings. So if the unified question is that if we give sufficient context, can we elicit mass interpretation for these two types of nouns? If we do, we can overcome the strong lexical bias and lexical blocking effect. Then we give very strong evidence for the syntactic count. Okay, let's move on to the second part to see how we conduct this study. So we have our research aims is that first of all we need to demonstrate with the experimental result to show quantity judgment task reveals only the preferred interpretation rather than the full range of grammatical possible interpretations. And also in terms of the empirical and the theoretical goals, we try to resolve the theoretical debate between the semantic count versus syntactic count by testing Mandarin nouns. We have three studies. The first study is about interpretation of count nouns. We're going to compare two experimental methods, quantity judgment task versus truth-bearing judgment task. In this study, we will validate our experimental approach. Then in study 2 and 3, we use truth-bearing judgment tasks and test the interpretation of collective nouns and animate nouns in Mandarin, in both Mandarin-speaking children and adults. So let's get into details about the study 1, establish methodological groundwork, comparing quantity judgment tasks versus truth-bearing judgment task on object nouns. So we have, in this study, we have two experiments. In experiment 1, we comparing quantity judgment tasks and truth-bearing judgment task to test bare nouns, bare object nouns in the same context. Then experiment 2, we investigate two sets of variables. One is context information and the other is morphosyntax. To see what are the possible factors that influence the interpretation of object nouns in Mandarin. So our research question is whether or not the choice of the two experimental method would affect Mandarin-speaking children and adults' interpretation of bare object nouns in experiment 1. We are already familiar with quantity judgment task. Let me say more about truth-bearing judgment task. So for the truth-bearing judgment task, this task is a method that tests how people interpret language by judging the truth value of sentences against the real-world situation. So we have two experimenters here. So one experimenter narrates the story, use toys. The other, after the story, and the other experimenter say something about the target sentence. Then the participants' task is to judge whether what the puppets say is true or false against the story. So they may accept sentence or they reject sentence. The acceptance and the reject sentence normally correspond to different interpretations. And when the participant rejects sentence, very often we ask them why, so to allow them to justify their rejection of the sentences. So there are at least two key features for this experimental task. First of all, which is very important for us, as this task can show the full range of possible readings. As I just said, the acceptance or rejection of the sentence corresponds to possible readings. So this task is very good for testing ambiguous sentences. And for this study, for this experiment, we test children and elders for these two methods. So for each method, we test different subjects. We have 20 children for the quant judgment task and the 20 children for truth-value judgment task. It's preschool children, and mean age is 4 years old. And we have the similar grouping for the LDOT group. Okay, so the experimental design is like this. This is the neutral context we present. So we have two pictures here. On one picture, this is the butterfly fairy, has two big balls. And the total amount of these two balls is 100 pounds. So on the other side, on the other picture, the bird fairy has 4 small balls, which amount to 10 pounds in total. So as you can see in this scenario, we have 2 distinct dimensions. One is cardinal number, 2 balls versus 4 balls. We also have a weight dimension, as 100 pounds versus 10 pounds. So we have provided these 2 dimensions, which corresponds to count interpretation versus mass interpretations corresponding. So for one task, so for quantity judgment tasks, as in the standard quantity judgment task, we have a puppet say, we ask the participant, 谁有更多球? Who has more ball? 谁有更多球? So yeah, I will give you a few seconds to think about. If I present this scenario to you and ask a question, 谁有更多球? So which character, which fairy would you choose? So the butterfly fairy or the bird fairy? Right. So then for another experiment, we present the same scenario, but we have different way to present the sentence. So instead of asking question, the puppet say, 蝴蝶仙女有更多球. So we ask you to justify, to judge whether the puppet sentence is true or false, right? So 蝴蝶仙女有更多球. So which would you say true or false towards the puppet statement? So this is how the quant judgment task and the truth value task differs. This very small change, but it's going to see later it will produce different outcome. So one is choice, force the choice, choose one of the fairies. The other asks you to judge the sentence whether it's true or false. Okay, so we test 1杯子球, and this is the result. Let's see quantity judgment task. For both children and adult, they all choose the bird fairy. So the character who has 4 small balls. So that means children and adults, they assign the count interpretation to the ball 100% of time. So this is very consistent to the result from previous study, right? As I reviewed, they all report dominant count interpretations by using quantity judgment task. So we use the same, very similar quantity judgment task and got very similar result. So based on this result, you may say the semantic account works. However, if we now we present the data for the truth-value judgment task, we got totally different result, especially for children. So for children, we got half count interpretation and half mass interpretation. So half children, when they asked to judge the sentence, 蝴蝶仙女有更多球, they would say yes. When they say yes, That means they assign the mass interpretation to the test sentence because Buddha has two bigger balls, which weigh 100 pounds, right? So more weight, more ball in terms of weight. But we can still say some children prefer the count interpretation. They reject the sentence, say this sentence is wrong. But for elders, somehow they still prefer the count interpretation. They reject the sentence 100 of the time. For this sentence, 我得先有更多球. Okay, so in that justification, they would say the bird fairy has more balls, or bird fairy has 4 balls, while the butterfly fairy has only 2 balls. So this is the justification when they reject the sentence for the count interpretation. Okay, so if we look at the within group, that means the method effect, we can see the change of experiment method for elders did not change the interpretation of bare nouns, bare object nouns. They still prefer the count interpretation for the object nouns. But for children, the exchange of experiment method changed the interpretation of bare nouns. So we got 100% of mass interpretations in this context by using truth-value judgment task. But the children, they assign 100% of count interpretation in the quantity judgment task. Okay, so if we see the data across age groups, the picture choice, the quantity judgment task, only count interpretation is possible for children and adults, but for the truth-value judgment task, children access the mass interpretation almost half of the time. Okay, so the key result for the study 1 is that both children and elders demonstrate a strong preference for the count interpretation in the quantity judgment task. However, the truth-value judgment task revealed significant methodological effect, particularly for children. So the children's interpretation showed the flexibility of accountability. So the truth-value judgment task enabled children to overcome the count preference bias, with the participant accessing the mass interpretation approximately 50% of the time. And this substantial shift demonstrates that children possess the grammatical competence to generate mass interpretation, even though this interpretation may be masked by preference effect in the quantity judgment task. Okay, so from these results, we can see the methodological advantage of truth-value judgment tasks. So this task provides participants with very explicit mass interpretation and candidates, allowing the participant to evaluate the truth value of these interpretations rather than just select force selection. So this design feature appears crucial for uncovering children's grammatical knowledge, but we may need to explain why this methodological fact does not show in the elders' interpretation. There are 2 possible reasons. One is the lexical fact. So some participants mentioned that when we say 更多, they mean 更多个, so the same thing as 更多个. So for them, 更多 is not neutral, it's associated with the count interpretation. Okay, so when they hear 更多, they would pick the cardinal dimension. And another thing is that another possibility is that elders they may have strong preference for the count interpretation for the object nouns. So yeah, these are the 2 possible reasons we can offer. So our reading suggests methodological factors significantly influence performance patterns. So with the truth-value judgment tasks provide a more comprehensive window into children's grammatical competence. Okay, So now with this conclusion, we move on to experiment 2. The research question is, how do non-linguistic context and the morphological cues, like classifiers, influence Mandarin-speaking children and elders' interpretation of object nouns by using truth-value judgment task? And we have just justified that truth-value judgment task is a better task for quantity judgment task. So yeah, we have 2 groups. Group 1, we test with the bare nouns, bare object nouns, but in 2 distinct contexts. And group 2, we test object nouns with the classifiers, again in 2 distinct contexts. And the children are preschool children. Mean age is 4 years old. So we provide 2 distinct contexts. One is we call it amount-oriented context. So the scenario is like this. So the yellow monster and the black monster, so they like eating. One day, the yellow monster found 2 big balls as heavy as 100 pounds, and the 2 black monsters found 4 small balls, which weighed 10 pounds only. So the yellow monster ate 2 big balls and became very full, and the black monster ate the small balls, but still very hungry. So you can see there's a subtle difference between this scenario different from the one we mentioned in experiment 1. So in experiment 1, we didn't mention one character is full, the other is hungry. So in this scenario, we add this information, full versus hungry, to indicate that the weight dimension is most important for us, even though this scenario provides 2 dimensions. So the weight versus number, as we did before, but we add more information, and the hungry versus the full, to underscore more about the weight dimension. So this is the very tricky difference we did in experiment 2. So we just mentioned we have 2 groups. So for one group, we present sentence like 环妖怪吃了更多球. So Huang Yaoguai is very full, and he ate the 2 big balls. Then the participant have to judge whether this sentence is true or false. Again, I'll give you several seconds to think about whether you would accept or reject the sentence. So Huang Yaoguai 吃了更多球 in this context. So we predict that in this amount-oriented context, the mass interpretation should be favored. So by accepting the sentence. So if you accept sentence, that means you assign the mass interpretation to this sentence. But you can also it could be also possible that you reject the sentence, right? So 环绕怪吃了更多球, you may say no. If you reject the sentence, then you assign the counter interpretation, because yellow monster only ate 2 balls. Okay, so you can see for the bare nouns, our experimental design allow 2 possible interpretations for the participants to choose from. And for the other group, we add the classifier 个, 环妖怪吃了更多个球. So with this more for syntactic markers for countabilities, only one interpretation is possible. So participant would only reject the sentence. We predict that the sentence would be rejected in this context. Okay, so this is our design of the amount-oriented context, which we want to trigger the mass interpretation. And moreover, we provide another context, which we call individual-oriented context. We hope to trigger the counter interpretation. So the scenario is like this, and the butterfly fairy and the bird fairy had a magic competition. So with the magic, the butterfly fairy made 2 heavy balls, weighing 100 pounds. With her magic, the bird fairy made 4 balls, weighing a total of only 10 pounds. So bird fairy won the competition, this one with a gold medal, and received a gold medal, and the butterfly fairy received a black cross. You can see most of the story details very similar to the amount-oriented context, but one important difference with the medals. Here, we give the gold medal to the bird fairy who has more balls. So we use this information, we try to use this clue to tell the participant. So in this story, the number is the most important information for us to make the pointy judgment. So even though we have the similar dimension, the cardinal dimension and weight dimension, but we underscore more about the cardinal dimension here. So that's why we call it is individual-oriented context. So against this story, we present group 1 participant with the bare noun sentence, 蝴蝶仙女变出了更多球. So 蝴蝶仙女更多球. So I would say you would reject sentence, right? And assign count interpretation in this context. Because this context emphasizes the number here. And for group 2, 蝴蝶仙女变出了更多个球. So for against this sentence, we expect participant to reject the sentence and assign count interpretation. Okay, so we test both the same nouns as we did in experiment 1, and this is the result. Okay, so this is the prediction. We say the semantic account and the syntactic account would have different predictions for this experiment. So the semantic account would predict the only count interpretation is possible. Remember, this account say with or without classifier, object nouns only assign the count interpretations. So for this semantic account, these two sentences have no differences. They only got a count interpretation. But for the semantic account, in the amount-oriented context, we should get mass interpretation because the bare nouns should have both count in readings and the mass readings when contexts are finistus. And with the classifier, then we have the count interpretation, and also in individual-oriented context, count interpretation is possible. So the difference between the semantic count and syntactic count is the result in the condition, in the amount-oriented conditions for the bare nouns. Okay, let's see the result. As you can see, the table here, for both children and adults, in the amount-oriented context, this is the result for the bare object nouns. 环妖怪吃了更多球. So for this context, we successfully triggered a degree, over 65% of mass interpretation for both children and adults. So these two groups, they adjusted the interpretations. The same children and adults, they assign 100% count interpretation in the individual-oriented context. So it means in this context, this magic competition, the same children and the same adults, they reject the sentence 100% of the time and assign count interpretation to the same noun, 更多球. Right. So you can see both children and adults, they adjust the responses in the two distinct contexts, depending on distinct context interpretations to the bare nouns. And the statistics show there's no significant difference between adults and children's acceptance of the tested sentence. That means the children have the similar percentage of mass interpretation as the adults. Okay, so we just see the result for the bare object nouns. Now let's move on to the object nouns co-occurring with the classifier, like the sentence 环妖怪吃了更多个球 or 蝴蝶仙女变出更多个球 so with classifier, individual classifier here. You can see the table, even though we manipulate the context, one is amount-oriented context, the other is individual-oriented context, but with the classifier, the participant only get 100% of account interpretation. So that means with the presence of classifier, the manipulation of context does not work here. So they all assign the counter interpretation 100 of the time. So this indicates that the classifier, so the context does not affect the interpretation of object nouns when they co-occur with the classifier. So the presence of classifier preempt the influence of contextual information. Okay, so let me summarize the findings in experiment 2. We can see that both children and adults assigned both count and mass interpretations to sentences containing bare object nouns, but only count interpretation when the object nouns appeared with individual classifier G. So this suggests that contextual manipulation affects the interpretation of sentence containing bare nouns, but has no effect on sentence containing classifier noun combination. So these morphosyntactic properties of classifiers are the most decisive factors in determining the countability of nouns, object nouns in Mandarin. So these results surely give support to the syntactic count. So according to syntactic count, the count mass distinction is structurally determined. So argue against the semantic count, which say the countability is lexically determined. Okay, so I think this is quite a nice result. So let's move on to the second study, which is about the countability of collective nouns in Mandarin. We actually have the very similar design, the manipulation of a context and the present absence of individual classifiers. And also we have the similar predictions for the semantic count and the syntactic count. And we test preschool children, but we use choose value judgment task for this type of nouns. Again, we provide two distinct contexts. So one is a mounted-oriented context. So here, Frog Monsters found a big table and a big chair. He ate them, became very full. And the Black Monsters found two small tables and two small chairs. And he is still very hungry. So against this scenario, we have two groups of participants. One group participant present with the banners, 青蛙妖怪吃了更多家具, and the other group present with the classifier, 青蛙妖怪吃了更多个家具. So we predict that in this amount-oriented context, the mass interpretation should be favored, even though the count interpretation is also possible. But with the classifier, only count interpretation is possible. And again, we have individual-oriented context. It's the similar magic competition, and with one fairy, purple fairy have with magic made a big table and a big chair, and the blue fairy created two tiny chairs and two tiny tables. And the judge gave the gold medal to the blue fairy and the dark cross to purple fairy. So against this individual oriented context, we present two sentences, one with the bare noun, 纸仙女变出了更多家具. The other one with classifier, 纸仙女变出更多个家具. Okay, so this is the result. For the bare collective nouns, we got very high percentage of mass interpretation. For the children, we got 95% of mass interpretation, and the elders, so 80% of mass interpretation. For this same participant, this assigned the count interpretation to bare collective nouns in individual-oriented context. By contrast with the classify co-occurring with the collective nouns, we only got the count interpretation. very similar to the result in our experiment with object nouns. So again, in this testing of collective nouns, we show that the countability of bare collectives is underspecified. They got both count and mass interpretations in appropriate context, but with the classifiers, they only got a noun interpretation. So this kind of result gives support to the syntactic count. And again, we apply the similar design to the countability of animate nouns with the similar questions, manipulate and design, like manipulation of context, and the presence, absence of individual classifier. Again, these two accounts, we have different predictions. Only the syntactic account predicts the existence of mass interpretation. And we test two groups and with truth-based judgment task. And again, we use the similar result design. Two monsters, so bird monsters and frog monsters like eating, they eat everything. So the bird monsters eat two big dogs and he ate it up and became very full. And the frog monsters catch four small dogs and became still very hungry. So against this scenario, we present the bare sentences. 大鸟妖怪吃了更多狗 and sentences with classifier 大鸟妖怪吃了更多只狗. So we predict in this amount-oriented context, the mass interpretation should be favored. And again, in individual-oriented context, again, is the magic computation and with the bare noun sentences and the classified sentences. We predict in this individual-oriented context, count reading should be favored. Okay, so this is the result. This result is exactly what we predicted from the syntactic perspective. We got the mass interpretation for the bare animate nouns in children, and 75%, in elders, 70%. But for the individual-oriented context, only count noun interpretation is possible. Okay, so a summary of our experimental result, you can see for all these types of nouns, object nouns, animate nouns, and collective nouns. So bare nouns are underspecified and very flexible in accountability. And blocking effect can be override. Remember Chen and Duchess and the Sibes mentioned that for animate nouns, mass nouns is not possible for the blocking effect, but this is not true. We found interpretation in mass interpretation in our result. Okay, so this the summary of all the result. Let's just have some general conclusion. So with this result, we can rethink our grammar. So we moved from, I think we should very confident to say we should think of grammar as a mirror that reflects pre-existing categories seen at active, rather than it is an instructor that tells us how to count and measure. So our experiment confirm this with the right context, even collective and animate nouns can receive mass interpretation, showing that countability is constructed in the syntax, not in the lexicon. So this insight came from methodological advancement. By using truth-based judgment task instead of quantity judgment task, we moved beyond measuring preferences to test all the grammatical possible interpretations. So in the last part, I say a little bit about the future direction. One is that our result have some implications for the cross-linguistic research. So we can test whether this syntax-first hypothesis applies cross-linguistically or not. So is syntactic control over lexical bias is a universal feature of language or not? According to Burrell or Pelletier, so classifiers in Mandarin or plural morphology in English, they have the similar functions in encoding countabilities. So according to this one, the syntax first hypothesis should be applied across linguistics. So we can apply truth-value judgment task with the supportive context and to languages with the different grammatical categories for countabilities. Actually, we start doing this. We extend our study to L2 study. We found that for native English adults and the Mandarin-speaking L2 learners of English, they assign both the count and the mass readings to collective English nouns, like more furniture, but they only assign the count interpretation to sentences with more pieces of furniture. Okay, and our results can also have some possible implications for clinical applications, insight for the developmental language disorder study. So we know that children with DLD often struggle with grammatical competence. So our truth-value judgment task paradigm isolate syntax and context. We think they can help to trigger grammatical possible interpretation. So we can just simply apply this truth-value judgment paradigm and comparing children with the DLD and versus typical children. So the potential outcome and impact is that performance patterns should clarify deficit in either syntactic computation or contextual integration. Findings can inform more target intervention, potentially focus on grammatical inflexibility or functional morphology. Okay, so this is the final take-home message. Back to the questions we raised in the beginning of this talk. We asked whether does the grammar just simply mirror the word, or the grammar instruct us on how to measure it. The answer is that the grammar instruct us on how to measure it. We're looking forward to more testing to see how this applies to different languages and different populations. Okay, so that's all. Thank you for your attention.